5. Cheap, plentiful, and tax-free, contraband smokes are generating millions of dollars.
They made more than $13 million of profit.
But who's really profiting?
There's no way organized crime will not want to have a piece of that.
Kevin Newman investigates the lucrative world of black market tobacco,
How big an industry do you suspect this is?
About $1 billion alone in Ontario a year.
where illegal suppliers play a dangerous game.
Am I going to get shot in the process and dumped in a landfill somewhere?
Authorities struggle to stop it,
The size of the business is unbelievable.
and the insatiable appetite for easy money
It's like a hungry machine. It never stops.
feeds the shadowy underworld of organized crime.
These cigarettes are killing people.
And an unthinkable tragedy breaks the spirit of innocent students, but strengthens the will of those who survived.
Just went to a funeral yesterday, and here he is going to play hockey.
The W5 TSN special presentation,
Nothing was stopping us from winning that game.
an uplifting story of a team rising above unspeakable grief
We wanted to bring positivity and happiness back to our community.
to survive, to win, and to honor.
I do believe they were there. I knew they were there.
Here is Kevin Newman.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. This week, we're taking you inside one of the biggest criminal smuggling operations in North America, something you may be unknowingly part of. Contraband cigarettes are smoked by hundreds of thousands of Canadians because they're cheap and because they can buy them in bulk. But in recent years, police say criminal gangs have infiltrated traditional businesses run by farmers and First Nations and brought with them the drugs, weaponry, and intimidation those gangs are known for. This is how a lot of smokers in Ontario cut the cost of their habit, by visiting reserves where tax-free cigarettes are sold. First Nations have treaty rights to produce and sell tobacco tax-free. It's a significant boost to the often depleted economies of their reserves. They can legally sell to whomever they want. If laws are being broken here, it's the off-reserve buyers who are doing it. But the savings are hard to resist. A fully taxed carton of 200 cigarettes usually costs about $100 in Ontario. And as our hidden cameras reveal, you can buy them easily and much cheaper on reserve.
How you doing, man? So I don't smoke, but my mom wants me to get a carton of cigarettes. So what's the one of the cheapest? Right cheap. 15, full flavor or light? Full flavor. How many of those can I get? About cartons? Full flavor? As many of them? Cartons or cases?
You can buy cases too when you have them.
Okay. So you can buy as many as you want at a time. What else you guys carry? Okay, cool.
Let's see what the guy sold me. They kind of look like Demoriers, but a couple of big differences. One is they don't have that scary graphic on them or the proper warning. And they also don't have the Canadian tax stamp on them, which means that these are illegal for someone like me to buy. Now, the guy charged me $50 for 200 cigarettes, which I thought was a lot, and maybe because I admitted that I wasn't a smoker, so I might not know the price point. So just to test that, we had our W5 producer buy exactly the same type and number of cigarettes down the road. He was charged $15 for all these, not $50, which means the price seems to be always negotiable, and you can buy as many of these as you want. The deep discounts have created a massive market of everyday Canadians becoming middlemen in the distribution of tax-free cigarettes outside of reserves. We watch this customer load 8 cases of cigarettes into an SUV with Nova Scotia plates. Now, 8 cases is about 80,000 cigarettes. You'd have to smoke 2 packs a day, every day, for more than 5 years to smoke that many cigarettes on his own. So it's likely he's planning to resell them for a profit. The government loses about $70 of tax revenue on every carton sold illegally. So that's about 28 grand worth of lost tax revenue in the back of that SUV. OPP Chief Superintendent John Sullivan is in charge of that force's Organized Crime Enforcement Bureau. How big an industry do you suspect this is?
For tobacco, we hear just in tax evasion about $1 billion alone in Ontario a year, and they say $2 to $3 billion in Canada per year.
Now, most smokers probably think they're simply supporting First Nations mom-and-pop businesses or exercising their right to protest high taxes. But smuggling cheap smokes off reserve ties them to something much bigger than that. Big-time criminal networks. Who do you know are involved in the contraband cigarette trade that you would define as organized crime gangs?
Well, for us, all the organized crime gangs. We've seen evidence, information, intelligence on all investigations on pretty well all the major organized crime, whether it's traditional, whether it's outlaw motorcycle gangs, whether it's the Asian organized crime, whether it's European. We've seen evidence in all of it.
Most recently, next door in Quebec, where a major police bust called Project Miguel exposed how embedded organized crime is in the movement of contraband tobacco through Indigenous land. On March 30th, 2016, hundreds of cops made their move. Lieutenant Patrick Condon was the lead coordinator for the Sûreté du Québec.
It was massive. It was actually the largest investigation of cross-border criminality we ever made, actually, between Canada and the States. So it was a first. Oh, at the end of this, specifically what we call the takedown, it was more than 1,000 officers working at the same day.
That's a massive investigation.
I told you it's the biggest one. Yeah.
The biggest ever across the border in North American history.
Yeah.
Police say the criminals smuggled millions of pounds of raw tobacco into Canada from the United States. From there, the tobacco was turned into cigarettes at manufacturing plants on First Nations reserves in Ontario and Quebec. And the profits were enormous.
For an example, you would buy full trucks in the United States for about 80,000 US. And then if you're able to manage to smuggle it to Canada, you can sell it back for 300,000.
There's that much money to be made.
That's one truck.
That's one truck.
Miguel, we're talking about more than 100 trucks.
This is $1 million rip-off business.
The evidence shows that for Miguel, 2 years, they made more than $13 million of profit.
30 million in profit.
That's profit.
56 people were arrested and 21 charged with fraud, conspiracy, and profiting from a criminal organization. And at the top of this massive Hell's Angel scheme was this man, Sylvain Etier.
Sylvain Etier was the head of the organization.
So it's reasonable to assume that he had eyes on most of that operation and had knowledge of it.
That's what the investigation shows.
Etier was released on bail, but his freedom didn't last long. He was gunned down outside his home 6 months later. Is it reasonable to assume that he was killed because some of what was said publicly about him were things that the Hells Angels may not have been aware of?
That's a possibility. The investigation, of course, is still going on that specific murder, but he was shot to death not long a time after the takedown. So that tells a lot.
Is it part of the investigation that he might have been double-tricking the HA themselves and maybe taking a little bit off to the side?
That's an interesting theory.
Etier's alleged co-conspirators are still awaiting trial. But the bust also revealed a member of the same organization that was smuggling tobacco was running a separate cocaine smuggling ring. The money that was being raised in moving tobacco, were you able to connect it to other illicit subjects?
From like the DEA investigation parts, they were moving cocaine with money we were picking up here in Montreal from different subjects. It's kind of hard to make actually direct links between the money from the tobacco and the drugs, but the same players are involved.
The ringleader of the cocaine ring was this fearsome-looking character. His name is Iraklis Javieropoulos, also known as Diesel. He pled guilty to drug trafficking and money laundering. Javieropoulos led the operation that smuggled 300 kilograms of cocaine from Peru. It was flown to Guatemala, then to Mexico, before being smuggled into the United States on its way to Montreal. He faces up to 20 years in prison. So cocaine, murder, smuggling, all connected to shadowy organized crime figures who also move contraband cigarettes. 3 residents of the Ganawagi Mohawk territory were charged during Project Miguel. The Indigenous police force on reserve cooperated with the SQ and RCMP. Grand Chief Joe Norton knows his people are at risk of getting tangled up with organized crime. From your own police forces, do you have reason to believe that there are cases of organized criminals, not your own people, but organized criminals who are taking advantage of this situation?
We're aware. That's all I can say.
And what action do you take?
Well, we inform the people that these individuals who are involved are not welcome here. They shouldn't be here, and that they should leave. They shouldn't participate.
Are you concerned at all that there are some members of your own community who may be intimidated into cooperation with organized crime?
It is difficult for our people to not be enticed to become involved. But it's a small percentage of the community. It's not everybody, okay? And I believe that once you get caught up in that web, it's pretty difficult to get out of it. I say to people, especially the young people, don't get caught up in this, because you're dealing with someone who will not show any mercy, will just go ahead and, kick the crap out of you or put a bullet to your head, and that's the way it is.
But the intimidation and reach of organized crime isn't restricted to First Nations territory. It starts in fall harvest season on the tobacco farms of southern Ontario, as well as across the border in the Carolinas. Legal tobacco is cut, sorted, dried, and cured in large kilns. Then it's baled and tagged so it can be easily counted by Ontario's Ministry of Finance, which tracks all the tobacco grown in the province. Its job is to make sure that all the leaf goes to licensed manufacturers who then help tax it. But sometimes, farmers are approached by shady characters and offered a lot more money to divert their crops to the black market. Sergeant Luc Bouvier is in charge of a special contraband tobacco unit with the Ontario Provincial Police.
They're a great community. They are hardworking people. That said, regretfully, we know that some of the tobacco grown in Ontario ends up in the illicit market. Yes, indeed, it does happen. If you look at the price on the legal side of it, they will get approximately for good tobacco, $2, maybe up to $2.40. If you look at the illicit market, you'll get $4, $5, $6, $8, $10 per pound. So I think the
economics are pretty obvious
yes.
there. If they can earn twice as much feeding the black market that they can the legal market, that's a pretty strong incentive.
It is.
It's hard to estimate how much, but Sergeant Bouvier says the majority of tobacco supplying Canada's contraband market comes from outside the country.
They need a lot of, nearly millions and millions of pounds. So if we look at the raw leaf deviation, there's no way that what we have growing in Ontario could support that. So it comes from elsewhere in the world, and there's a lot of it coming in.
He says it's shipped in from China, India, Pakistan, or as in Project Miguel, it is trucked up from the United States and smuggled across the border by people like this man. We're calling him Tony, and he knows all about dealing with organized crime.
They're dangerous people. Your heart's pounding in your chest. Am I going to make this load, or am I going to get shot in the process and thrown in the back of the trailer and dumped in a landfill somewhere?
Borders disappear.
Criminals have taken advantage of that.
When there are millions to be made.
I was going to illegitimate companies that made illegal cigarettes.
When W5 continues.
He has enough for a case.
Spend a few hours on a First Nations reserve and you'll likely see a steady stream of non-Indigenous customers buying cheap, tax-free cigarettes. These people drove away and into downtown Belleville with a couple of cases worth, likely to give away or resell to family and friends. While it's not technically legal for non-First Nations to buy and leave the reserve, most people see what's happening here as a minor tax dodge at worst. But it's much more than that. Contraband tobacco is an extremely well-organized billion-dollar cash cow for organized crime. Most of it is smuggled into Canada by people like this man, who we're calling Tony.
I brought some cut rag so I can show you what it looks like. This is the cut rag that we haul up. This is tobacco leaf cut up into small shreds. This is about enough to make 2 cartons of cigarettes.
Tony has been a tobacco smuggler for about 15 years, and this is what he smuggles into Canada from the Carolinas. 220-pound boxes full of tobacco, 35,000 pounds per load.
The broker would get the information from the big shots. They would call us, they would get the material lined up on the other end. I would arrange the truck to go down and then I would bring the material back up.
Tony estimates he made the trip north up to 1,000 times. Once it's turned into cigarettes, each load of tobacco is worth upwards of $2 million to the criminals. That puts the potential total value of what he's smuggled at more than $2 billion.
Oh, it blew my mind because the size of the business is unbelievable. It's like a hungry machine. It never stops.
At first, Tony was instructed to drop off the tobacco at warehouses on the American side of the border.
I started out running what I thought was legitimate, going up in the northern New York. You know, you think you're okay until you start seeing some of the warning signs that something's not right, but then you're already doing it.
Before long, he says he was going through customs with doctored paperwork. But his handlers were well organized. They took care of every detail, and he never got caught.
They would keep track of us, and when you get close to the border, we want to know you're going to be there. And then they say, when you go across, we want you to take lane 3. They know exactly how to manipulate it, where to get the material, and how to get it up there, how to get it across.
The paperwork, called bills of lading, specify where the product is coming from, what it is, and where it's supposed to end up. But it always ends up somewhere else.
Some of it would sit on the dock and it would be put right onto another trailer and taken off up north. There was several times that all of a sudden there'd be what I would call a shady character in the area that you could tell was there to watch just the product to make sure everything was done properly. They kept a distance, they kept their faces covered, they would wear a hoodie, walk around, and you could tell they were in charge just by the way they would talk to people. You know, after a while we found out it was going to illegitimate companies that made illegal cigarettes.
The raw tobacco usually ends up on reserves, where it's turned into cigarettes in places like Six Nations and Ganawage near Montreal.
Well, there's always an investigation going on.
Lieutenant Patrick Condon with the Sûreté de Québec says that is no accident.
As we speak, 100% of the manufacturers we know of that are operating illegally are situated on reserve.
And they're deeply embedded with criminal organizations because that's the only place that they can get their source material.
The source material is controlled by organized crime, and they're protecting that business. So, yes, they need to deal with them.
Or where do they operate?
They're everywhere, I would say.
That's true enough. That's true enough.
But they are highly involved on the reservation.
First Nations people have their own police forces. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me if they were involved in the project at all and cooperated with it?
Well, they were involved at the end, like when we need to make some arrest on their territory. So we asked them assistance actually to do those arrests on their territory.
Organized crime knows outside police coming on reserve is a sensitive issue for First Nations. And Ganawage Grand Chief Joe Norton says crime gangs take full advantage of that political tension. Do you think they can get away with it easier here than they can off reserve?
They can. I mean, that's what they say. And so it's easier for them to come here than to try and do something out here.
But as Grand Chief,
we have to come down.
Doesn't that
Yes.
bother you tremendously?
Yes, it does. That's why we've worked on this cooperativeness with the federal government and with the authorities here in the province of Quebec and the surrounding area. Otherwise, if we didn't give a damn, we didn't care and just said, let them do what they want, we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't be involved. And you have to say to people, don't use our rights to support criminal activities or gangs that come into the community. And I think that's where we have to draw the line.
Because Mohawk territory exists on both sides of the Canada-US border, smugglers target it.
We're heading to St. Regis Indian Reserve, known as Akwesasne.
This man, who we're calling Max, has worked undercover at the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne for 30 years. First as a New York State trooper, and now as a private investigator. He agreed to take us on a tour of the reservation that's become known as a Smugglers Paradise.
It's the convergence of Ontario, Quebec, and New York make it a political nightmare, especially for policing. And the criminals have taken advantage of that.
But he points out that while a few First Nations make money from contraband tobacco, powerful groups like the Hells Angels and Russian Mafia take most of the profits.
The vast majority is going to the organized crime families that control them. The people doing the work are making very good money. You have high school kids, and they pay for lookouts, and they'll pay them upwards of $50 an hour just to sit with binoculars and cell phones. I wouldn't say they're being taken advantage of, but being used would be a fair description. Chances are there's tobacco in that white van right there pulling out. It's just constantly on the move down here, constantly.
As we drive, he points out vehicles likely transporting tobacco to nondescript storage warehouses and other buildings where the illegal cigarettes are manufactured. And there's a lot of them.
There's another warehouse here on the left. This is another smuggler. That's one of the most active warehouses on the reserve. You just see it down there for a second. This building in front of us, the little white one there, has a cigarette machine in it. They produce tobacco, cigarettes in there.
Cigarette machines like this one captured in undercover video can be purchased online by any manufacturer, legal or illegal. These machines are capable of pumping out 8,000 cigarettes a minute.
As soon as we make a left, we're in the province of Quebec.
It doesn't take long to figure out the border crossing gaps for smugglers. As the road winds its way through the reserve, we crisscross the invisible border without even realizing it.
The international boundary runs right down the middle of this road. It's just the way it was laid out. And the right side is plowed by Quebec. The other side is plowed by the state of New York.
Smugglers can also get to Canada anywhere along the river by boat or snowmobiles in the winter.
You can see the tracks where they cross. That's where they cross right into St. Regis, Quebec.
The irony is most of the unmanned crossings are in the shadow of the customs bridge to Cornwall, Ontario.
The cars we see going over right now, they're traveling from the United States into Canada. When they hit the other end of the bridge, they hit Canadian customs. You go with the boat, and you can take any product you want from either side with very little interference.
With well-oiled criminal gangs corrupting truckers, tobacco farmers, First Nations, and anyone else standing in their way, Lieutenant Condon says you need an equally well-organized police response.
It shows that you need to put lots of effort to stop those criminal organizations because they are organized, so then our systems need to be organized to fight against them.
Illegal tobacco, illicit cargo, and big profit as the law fights to stop it.
If you have more resources, then you could do a lot more damage.
when W5 continues.
In the 1980s, public safety campaigns started making Canadians more aware of the long-term health effects of smoking.
Smoking. It will suck the life right out of you.
But more recently, government has forced tobacco companies to make their product more fire retardant too. But contraband cigarettes don't have that. And that's leading to more tragic house fires, like the ones the Assistant Deputy Fire Chief in London, Ontario, Jack Burt, is confronting.
Contraband cigarettes do not go out. They continue to burn, and they're causing fires. And people are dying.
And those deaths are horrific. In November, a woman at this seniors' care home fell asleep while smoking.
She was elderly. She had limited mobility. Fire started in the living room, and our crews found her in the bathroom as she was trying to get out a window. She never did make it.
And contraband cigarettes were the cause of her death?
Contraband cigarettes were everywhere. There was a big bag of cigarettes on the table, and we were able to attribute contraband cigarettes to being the cause of the fire.
How often are contraband cigarette fires leading to death so far?
From what we're tracking, 4 of our last 5 deaths here in the city dating back to 2014 are related to contraband cigarettes.
That's shocking.
It is shocking, and it is underreported.
How frustrating is this for you?
I find it very frustrating. My job is to stop fires, my job is to stop fire injuries, my job is to stop fire deaths. When somebody dies, I failed. Hopefully this message gets out there. Hopefully they listen, because these cigarettes are killing people.
To better illustrate the danger of contraband cigarettes, the Deputy Fire Chief takes us inside their burn tower.
Now we're into the burning.
Where he's set up a comparison test for W5. Half the cigarettes are legal, the other half are not, and they're much more likely to start a fire. So this side, obviously the contraband cigarettes.
Yeah.
That we obtained from the police. And on this side, the professional cigarettes. So we've lit this at about the same time.
Correct.
And what do you expect to see happen?
Well, what we're going to see is the contraband cigarettes are going to burn, they're going to free burn, and they're going to burn right down to their filters.
What's in these professionally made cigarettes that stops them from burning so quickly?
So with these particular cigarettes, typically what they'll have is a band or 3 inside the cigarettes, whereas it burns down, it hits one of the bands. And the band is actually less porous paper. So the air doesn't get in to feed the fire for the tobacco, and it actually causes it to snuff itself out.
These don't have that kind of suppression technology inside of them.
No, and they're going to burn right down to the filters. Most of your conventional cigarettes are already burnt out, whereas these are all still free burning.
That's interesting. Yeah, this one's stopped, that one's stopped. These are going slow, but these are all just tearing right down to their filters.
Yep.
So this fire limiting technology, that for a while anyway, seems to have helped reduce the number of cigarette fires in many places in the country.
Dramatically.
But now that these seem to be growing in huge numbers, are you seeing the number of fires caused by cigarettes to come back?
We are seeing that, and we're also seeing the fire deaths associated with it.
Organized crime is unlikely to spend any of its huge tobacco profits on safety improvements, so it's up to authorities. Quebec started a program specifically to go after the organized crime networks that are trafficking in contraband cigarettes in 2001. Here's Lieutenant Patrick Condon with the Sûreté du Québec.
At that time, the contraband was quite high here in Quebec. Like it was something around 30 to 40% of contraband.
They've been able to significantly reduce those numbers because of a series of investigations that have dealt major blows to organized crime smuggling operations. How many Quebecois today are dealing with contraband tobacco?
Well, as we speak today, the numbers are oscillating between 10 to 15% of contraband from the Quebec province.
So you've taken a big bite out of that industry.
Yes, the numbers are great. It shows on like the taxations levels. It shows on the contraband levels.
Is there value for money in having this many police officers engaged in trying to shut down contraband cigarettes if you're a taxpayer?
I think the latest numbers is like for every dollar the government spends in the access program, there's a coming back of more than $14, I would say, in taxation.
Well, as encouraging as those numbers in Quebec are, much of Canada's contraband cigarette problem originates in Ontario. So far, police in that province haven't made much of a dent. Here's OPP Chief Superintendent John Sullivan.
40% they're saying now in Ontario is contraband tobacco sold, right? So that's a big part of the market. Almost half of the market's contraband, right? So, and then of course that's floating all over the country.
Sullivan says the OPP's specialized contraband tobacco enforcement team has only been operating since 2016. And compared to Quebec's 60-person unit, his is a small team.
We have 4 constables, a sergeant, an analyst, and a member from the Ministry of Finance with us.
Well, that doesn't sound like enough.
They're pretty effective for a small team. And that being said, you're right, they're not probably big enough for doing surveillance and things, so we have to supplement them with other organized crime enforcement members or with our surveillance teams and things like that to help them out. But yeah, if you have more resources, then you could do a lot more damage, right?
He says the other problem is his officers have limited powers to attack the problem. And even when they arrest someone, the penalties don't fit the crime.
The maximum sentence on the criminal code is 5 years. For some of the drug stuff, it's life. And from what we're seeing for first offenders, it's mostly fines. So I think the reward at the end of the day can be a lot higher than that risk, right?
Police in Ontario also have far fewer powers than officers in Quebec. They often have to rely on the Ministry of Finance to conduct an investigation.
The Quebec police right across Quebec got a lot more powers, more taxation powers than we have in Ontario.
So what can they do that you can't
right now?
Well,
they just have broader search and seizure powers, right? We're pretty well running on plain view kind of thing. If we see it, we can go after, but other than that, we're kind of handcuffed.
So only a handful of Ontario officers to stop truckloads of smuggled tobacco, get to the source of the crime, take on the most dangerous organized crime rings, while hundreds of thousands of everyday Canadians feed the illegal trade, thinking it's simply a tax protest. It hardly seems like a fair fight. Well, that playing field may soon be a little more level because this week in its budget, the Ontario government pledged to attach more police to illicit cigarettes and better track raw tobacco. But at the same time, they also increased the price of a legal carton of cigarettes by $4, which critics say will only drive more people to the black market. Here's what's straight ahead.
After surviving a nightmare, a team gathers its courage to play.
I think this might have been a bad decision. Like, it's too soon.
When W5 continues.